On a scorching afternoon in November 1958, a routine oil survey flight over the Libyan desert was about to stumble upon something impossible. British petroleum geologist Gordon Bowerman was scanning the endless sand below when he noticed something that shouldn't exist, a glint of metal reflecting sunlight in one of the most desolate corners of the Sahara. As their small aircraft circled lower, what emerged from the shifting dunes made Bowerman's blood run cold. It was an American B-24 Liberator bomber, sitting nearly intact in the desert sand, as if it had landed there yesterday. The aircraft looked pristine. No signs of fire, no major structural damage, just a four-engine warplane resting peacefully in an ocean of sand 140 miles from the nearest coastline. But that was impossible. No bomber had any reason to be this deep in the Sahara, and if one had crashed here, it should have been torn apart by the impact, buried by sandstorms, or stripped by scavengers over the years. Yet this aircraft looked like its crew had simply parked it and walked away. When Bowerman reported his discovery to British authorities, it triggered an investigation that would take months to unravel and ultimately reveal one of World War II's most devastating survival stories. What happened to the crew of this lost bomber would redefine what experts thought humanly possible about desert survival, and prove that sometimes the truth is far more horrifying than any mystery. This is the story of how 9 young Americans vanished into the Sahara in 1943, and what searchers discovered 16 years later that explained exactly how they died. To understand what happened to that bomber and its crew, we need to go back 15 years to April 4th, 1943. World War II had been raging for nearly 4 years, and the Mediterranean theatre had become crucial for Allied victory. Control of North Africa meant control of supply routes, and every bombing mission brought the Allies one step closer to pushing Axis forces out of the region. On a dusty airstrip near Benghazi, Libya, 25 American B-24 Liberator bombers sat ready for a critical strike against Naples, Italy. The target was the harbour and supply depots that kept German and Italian forces equipped across North Africa. It should have been a routine mission. Fly north across the Mediterranean, drop bombs on strategic targets, return to base before nightfall. Among those aircraft was a brand new B-24D Liberator that had never seen combat. Assigned to the crew was a young pilot, First Lieutenant William Hatton, who would be making his first combat flight. His crew of 9 men were mostly teenagers, fresh from training and eager to prove themselves in actual warfare. But the moment engines started warming up that morning, problems began emerging. Weather conditions were deteriorating rapidly across the region. Strong winds whipped across the desert, carrying thick clouds of sand that reduced visibility to almost nothing. The infamous Saharan sandstorms that had plagued armies since ancient times were building into a choking wall of grit and dust. As the first wave of bombers attempted takeoff, pilots immediately recognized they were facing conditions far more dangerous than anyone anticipated. Sand wasn't just reducing visibility, it was infiltrating engines, clogging air filters, creating mechanical problems that could prove fatal over enemy territory. One by one, aircraft commanders made the difficult decision to abort the mission and return to base. By the time the second wave prepared for departure, only a handful of bombers remained committed to flying. Most of the squadron had already turned back, their pilots unwilling to risk their crews in such hazardous conditions. But the crew of that brand new B-24D made a fateful decision. Despite worsening weather, despite seeing other aircraft turn back, despite every warning sign screaming at them to abort, they chose to press on with the mission. The bomber lifted off from the Libyan airstrip and disappeared into the swirling wall of sand and cloud, heading north toward the Mediterranean Sea. It would be 16 years before anyone learned what happened next. Flying through the sandstorm proved even worse than the crew anticipated. Inside the aircraft, sand infiltrated every crack and crevice. Navigation became nearly impossible as familiar landmarks vanished beneath the storm. Radio communication grew sporadic due to atmospheric interference. They were essentially flying blind through a world of swirling brown chaos. But these were trained military personnel who had prepared for exactly this kind of challenge. They pressed onward toward their target in Naples, determined to complete their mission despite the mounting difficulties. Hours passed as they fought through the storm, the bomber's 4 engines straining against headwinds that threatened to push them off course. When they finally approached the Italian coast, a new problem emerged. Cloud cover over Naples was so thick that identifying targets became impossible. The harbour, the supply depots, the strategic installations they had studied in mission briefings, all of it completely obscured by impenetrable clouds. Military protocol was clear. When target identification was impossible, bombers were to return to base with their ordnance intact. Bombing blindly risked killing civilians and wasting precious explosives, so the crew made the only decision they could: abort the bombing run and head back to Libya. The bomber turned south, beginning what should have been a routine flight home. The crew likely felt disappointed at aborting their first combat mission, but they had followed proper procedures and would live to fight another day, or so they thought. What none of them realized was that their real ordeal was just beginning. The sandstorm that had complicated their departure was still raging over Libya, and now they would have to navigate through it in complete darkness. Night had fallen during their flight to Naples, and without ground lights or clear skies to guide them, finding their small airstrip in the vast desert would prove nearly impossible. As the bomber flew south through the black void, navigation equipment began failing. The automatic direction finder, crucial for maintaining proper bearing, started malfunctioning due to harsh conditions. Without this vital instrument, they were flying blind through a featureless world of sand and darkness. Radio contact with base became intermittent. When messages did get through, responses were often garbled or incomplete. Ground personnel were dealing with their own challenges as the sandstorm continued wreaking havoc across the region. Hour after hour, the bomber continued flying south, burning through fuel at an alarming rate. The crew knew they should have reached their base by now, but there was no sign of the familiar coastline or airstrip lights. Instead, they found themselves flying over endless darkness, with no landmarks visible below, and no way to determine their exact position. As fuel gauges dropped toward empty, a terrible realization began settling over the 9 men aboard. They were lost somewhere over the Sahara Desert, flying blind through a sandstorm, with no navigation equipment and rapidly diminishing fuel. The decisions they would make in the next few minutes would determine not just their immediate survival, but their fate in one of the most inhospitable environments on Earth. With fuel gauges approaching empty and no sign of their base anywhere below, Lieutenant Hatton faced an impossible choice: attempt to land in complete darkness over unknown terrain and risk a catastrophic crash that would kill everyone instantly, or abandon the aircraft while they still had altitude and hope their parachutes would carry them safely to ground. Hatton made the call that would save their lives in the short term while condemning them to an ordeal beyond comprehension. The order went out across the intercom: prepare to bail out. Each man strapped on his parachute, checked his gear, and prepared for what they hoped would be a routine jump followed by a quick rescue. They believed they were somewhere over the Mediterranean Sea, close enough to the Libyan coast that search teams would locate them within hours. One by one, the 9 crew members made their way to exit hatches. The roar of wind and engines filled their ears as they prepared to leap into darkness below. None could imagine they were about to jump, not into the relatively forgiving Mediterranean waters, but onto the edge of one of the most hostile environments on the planet. The first man jumped, his parachute blossoming in darkness. Then the second, the third, until all 9 members had abandoned their aircraft and were drifting down through the black night toward what they hoped would be salvation. But as their feet touched solid ground instead of water, horrifying realization began to dawn. The sand beneath their boots told a story none wanted to believe. They had not jumped over the Mediterranean as planned. Instead, they had bailed out over the Sahara Desert, hundreds of miles inland from their intended position. The bomber, meanwhile, continued its ghost flight through darkness. With no crew aboard to guide it, the aircraft flew on autopilot for another 15 miles before finally running out of fuel completely. It glided down through the night sky and settled into the desert floor, breaking apart slightly but remaining largely intact in the soft sand. As dawn broke over the desert on April 5th, 1943, 8 of the 9 crew members managed to locate each other using flares and whistle signals. They had scattered across several miles during their parachute descent, but military training had taught them regrouping procedures. However, relief at surviving quickly turned to concern. Lieutenant John Waravka, the bombardier, was nowhere to be found, despite repeated attempts to signal him with flares and shouts across the empty desert. They would never see him again. As the sun climbed higher and temperature began to rise, the 8 survivors took stock of their situation. What they discovered filled them with dread. They had landed in the middle of nowhere, with nothing but empty sand dunes stretching to every horizon. No sign of civilization, no roads, no landmarks that might guide them towards safety. Their survival equipment was minimal. Between the 8 men, they had just one half-full canteen of water, a few emergency rations, and the clothes on their backs. They had been equipped for a routine bombing mission, not for survival in one of the world's most unforgiving environments. But these were trained military personnel, men who had been taught never to surrender, regardless of circumstances. They quickly organized themselves and began planning for survival and rescue. Someone would surely be looking for them by now, and if they could hold out for a day or two, help would certainly arrive. Lieutenant Hatton, as senior officer, took command. After consulting with his crew, he made what seemed like a logical decision based on their training. They would walk northwest back toward where they believed the Libyan coast should be located. Their calculations suggested the coastline couldn't be more than 50 or 60 miles away. For men in good physical condition, that represented perhaps 2 or 3 days of walking across relatively flat terrain. They had survived worse challenges during military training. What none of them knew was that their calculations were catastrophically wrong. They had actually landed nearly 450 miles inland from the coast, on the very edge of the Kalanshio Sand Sea, a 24,000 square mile expanse of shifting dunes where daytime temperatures regularly exceeded 130 degrees Fahrenheit. There was no water, no vegetation, no shade, and no possibility of finding food in this lunar landscape of endless sand. As the 8 men began their march northwest on the morning of April 5th, they carried with them hope that rescue was just days away. They had no way of knowing they were walking into what would become one of the most extraordinary tests of human endurance ever recorded. The desert stretched before them like an endless ocean of sand, beautiful and terrible in the morning light. With each step away from their landing site, they moved further from any possibility of quick rescue and deeper into a wilderness that had claimed countless lives throughout history. Their first day of walking brought cruel lessons in desert survival. Morning started with relatively mild temperatures and even a slight breeze that provided some relief. The men felt optimistic as they established a steady pace, military training keeping them organized and focused. But as the sun climbed higher in the cloudless sky, temperature began to soar. By midday, heat became almost unbearable. Sand beneath their feet radiated warmth like a massive oven, and air shimmered with heat waves that distorted their vision. Every breath felt like inhaling fire, and their uniforms became soaked with perspiration that evaporated almost instantly in bone-dry air. Lieutenant Robert Toner, the co-pilot, had begun keeping a diary. He had a small notebook in his flight suit pocket, and he started documenting their ordeal. His first entry on April 5th captured the growing severity of their situation. Start walking northwest. Still no sign of John. Half canteen of water between 8 men. 1 capful per day per person. Nights are brutally cold, with no sleep possible. The contrast between day and night temperatures proved to be one of their most challenging obstacles. While daytime brought scorching heat that made movement nearly impossible, nightfall brought bone-chilling cold that prevented any rest. The desert's inability to retain heat meant temperatures plummeted dramatically after sunset, leaving the men shivering in thin flight suits. They quickly adapted their strategy, choosing to travel primarily during cooler hours of dawn and dusk, while seeking whatever minimal shade they could find during blazing afternoon hours. But finding shade in this barren landscape proved nearly impossible. There were no rocks, no vegetation, no natural formations that could provide relief from the relentless sun. By the second day, effects of dehydration became apparent. Their carefully rationed water supply disappeared faster than anticipated, and the men found themselves constantly thinking about liquid. Their mouths became dry and sticky, tongues swollen, lips cracked and bleeding from arid conditions. The psychological toll was perhaps even worse than physical suffering. Each man dealt with growing realization that they might not survive. Some maintained outward optimism, encouraging companions and insisting rescue teams would find them soon. Others grew quiet and withdrawn, conserving energy for the grueling march ahead. Tona's diary entries became increasingly desperate as days passed. Hit sand dunes, everyone extremely weak. Sergeant Lamotte's eyes gone completely blind from sand and glare. Rest of us suffering severe eye problems. Still heading northwest, but progress much slower. The sand blindness that afflicted the group was caused by intense reflection of sunlight off the desert floor. Without proper eye protection, brilliant white sand acted like a massive mirror, creating a condition similar to snow blindness that left several crew members unable to see clearly. This made navigation even more difficult and forced stronger members to guide their blinded companions. As they struggled across increasingly challenging landscape of high dunes, physical condition deteriorated rapidly. The combination of extreme dehydration, malnutrition, exhaustion, and exposure was taking a devastating toll. Men who had been in peak physical condition days earlier were now stumbling and falling as they tried to maintain their northwestern heading. The sand dunes themselves presented new torture. Climbing each ridge required enormous effort in their weakened state, and loose sand made every step a struggle. They would climb laboriously to the top of a dune, hoping to see some sign of civilization or water, only to be confronted with another endless vista of identical sandhills stretching to the horizon. Days blurred together in a nightmare of heat, thirst, and exhaustion. Their emergency rations had been consumed within the first 48 hours. The water was long gone. They were now surviving on absolutely nothing, their bodies consuming themselves just to keep functioning. Tona continued documenting their ordeal in his diary, though his handwriting became increasingly shaky and difficult to read. Day 5. Can barely walk, eyes almost gone. Hatton, Hayes, Adams and Lamotte cannot continue. Very weak. Decided Ripslinger, Shelley and Moore will go ahead for help. By April 9th, 5 days after their ordeal began, the situation had become hopeless for some members. Lieutenant Hatton, Lieutenant Tona, Lieutenant Hayes, Sergeant Adams and Sergeant Lamotte could no longer continue the march. Their bodies had reached the absolute limit of human endurance. The 3 remaining men who still had some strength left faced an agonizing decision. Should they stay with their fallen comrades and die together, or continue northwest in hopes of finding help? After what must have been an excruciating discussion, the group made their choice. Sergeants Harold Ripslinger, Guy Shelley, and Vernon Moore would continue the march while the others waited for rescue. It was a decision that tore at all 8 men's hearts, but it represented their last hope. The 3 departing soldiers gathered what little remained of their supplies and prepared for what they knew might be their final attempt to reach civilization. They promised their companions they would return with help, though everyone understood the odds. Tona's final diary entries captured the desperation of those left behind. Shelley, Ripslinger and Moore have gone on for help. Rest of us are too weak. Eyes nearly gone. Still very cold at night. No help yet. His last entry, dated April 12th, consisted of just a few words that would haunt investigators for years. No help yet. Very cold night. Everybody getting ready. Sotwat. As the three strongest members disappeared over the dunes to the northwest, 5 men lay dying in the sand, their bodies finally succumbing to brutal conditions they'd fought against for more than a week. They had walked an estimated 85 miles through some of the most hostile terrain on Earth, with virtually no water or food. But the story of the 3 men who continued wasn't over. Ripslinger, Shelley and Moore pressed on through endless dunes, driven by desperate hope they could find help and return to save their dying comrades. They had no way of knowing they were still hundreds of miles from the nearest settlement. Sergeant Harold Ripslinger, at just 21 years old, had become the unofficial leader of this final push. His methodical approach and unwavering focus kept the small group moving when every instinct screamed at them to collapse. Behind him, Sergeants Shelley and Moore matched his pace despite their own deteriorating conditions. The landscape around them had become increasingly surreal. Sand dunes stretched higher and more dramatically than anything they had encountered before, some towering 600 feet above the desert floor like frozen waves in an ocean of gold and white. The physical effort required to climb these massive formations was staggering for men who had been surviving on virtually nothing for over a week. The hallucinations began on their second day alone. Dehydration and extreme exhaustion started playing tricks with their minds. Shelley would suddenly point at what appeared to be palm trees in the distance, only to have the vision dissolve into more empty dunes as they approached. Moore began having conversations with family members who weren't there. Their water had been gone for days. They tried every desperate measure to find moisture. They attempted to collect dew by spreading pieces of clothing during brief cool hours before dawn, but the air was too dry. They dug frantically in low-lying areas where water might collect, but found only more sand. The physical deterioration was becoming grotesque. Their lips had cracked so severely that speaking became painful, and tongues had swollen to the point where swallowing was nearly impossible. Their skin had taken on a leathery texture, burned by sun and scoured by wind-blown sand. On what must have been their 11th or 12th day in the desert, Sergeant Guy Shelley could go no further. His body simply shut down. Ripslinger and Moore stayed with him as long as they could, but eventually they had to make the agonizing decision to continue without him. 2 men now, Ripslinger and Moore, pressed on. How they continued moving defied all medical understanding. The human body can typically survive only 3 to 4 days without water under desert conditions. These men had been walking for nearly 2 weeks with virtually nothing. Eventually, Sergeant Vernon Moore collapsed. Ripslinger stayed with him, but Moore urged him to continue, to keep going, to find help. So Ripslinger pressed on alone, stumbling through the dunes in a state that was more death than life. Sergeant Harold Ripslinger walked over 109 miles through the Sahara Desert before his body finally gave out. When his remains were eventually discovered, he was found face down in the sand, his arms stretched forward as if he had been crawling when death finally claimed him. He had travelled further than any of his companions, driven by sheer willpower that defied human comprehension. But we're getting ahead of the story. Because for 15 years, nobody knew any of this had happened. When the bomber failed to return to base on April 4th, 1943, search and rescue operations were immediately launched. Aircraft crisscrossed the Mediterranean and the Libyan coast for days, looking for any sign of the missing crew. The military searched for weeks, but they were looking in all the wrong places. Nobody imagined the crew could have ended up 400 miles inland. The prevailing assumption was that they had gone down in the Mediterranean, and that if any crew members had survived the crash, they would have been picked up by German or Italian forces and held as prisoners of war. As months turned into years with no word from any of the crew, the military eventually declared all 9 men killed in action. Their families received the devastating news and tried to move on with their lives, never knowing the truth about what had happened to their loved ones. The bomber, meanwhile, sat in the desert exactly where it had landed, slowly being covered and uncovered by shifting sands. The bodies of the crew lay scattered across more than 100 miles of desert, gradually being buried and preserved by the dry conditions. For 15 years, the Sahara kept its secret, but in November 1958, everything changed when Gordon Bowerman spotted that glint of metal from his oil survey flight. What he had discovered would set in motion one of the most extensive recovery operations in military history. When the first recovery team reached the bomber in February 1959, what they found seemed impossible. The aircraft was sitting in the sand largely intact, looking like it had landed just days ago instead of 16 years earlier. The landing gear was up, indicating the crew had successfully bailed out. There was no fire damage, no signs of violent impact, but it was what they found inside the bomber that truly shocked the investigators. The aircraft's guns were still loaded and in perfect working order. The radio equipment appeared functional. In the cockpit, they found coffee thermoses that still contained liquid coffee, preserved by the desert's extreme dryness. Maps and navigation charts lay on the navigator's table, showing the planned route from Libya to Naples and back. Everything was exactly as the crew had left it when they bailed out, frozen in time by the Sahara's unique conditions. The recovery team began the painstaking work of searching the surrounding desert for any trace of the crew. They spread out in all directions from the aircraft, walking grid patterns across the sand dunes, looking for anything that might indicate where the men had gone. What they discovered over the following months told a story so extraordinary that military survival experts initially refused to believe it. The first body was found about 78 miles northwest of the aircraft. It was Sergeant Adams. Then they found Lieutenant Hayes, then Lieutenant Lamotte. Each discovery pushed the boundaries of what anyone thought possible about desert survival. But the real shock came when they discovered Lieutenant Robert Toner's body and found his diary still in his flight suit pocket. When investigators carefully extracted the small notebook and began reading Toner's entries, the full horror of what these men had endured finally became clear. The diary documented every agonizing day of their ordeal, from the initial optimism of the first day to the growing desperation as they realized how dire their situation had become. Toner's words brought their nightmare to life. 1 capful of water per day per person. Eyes nearly gone from sand and glare. Very cold at night. No help yet. And I shall you marry. His final entry, everybody getting ready, suggested the men knew death was coming and had made their peace with it. The diary also revealed information that helped search teams understand where to look for the remaining crew members. Based on Toner's notes about Ripslinger, Shelley, and Moore continuing northwest, search parties extended their efforts further into the desert. They found Lieutenant Hatton's body 85 miles from the crash site, then Sergeant Shelley at 91 miles. The distances were staggering. These men had walked further through the Sahara without water than anyone had thought humanly possible. When they finally discovered Sergeant Harold Ripslinger, investigators were stunned. His body lay 109 miles northwest of the crash site. He had travelled further than any of his companions, driven by determination that defied all medical understanding of human limits. The position of his body, face down with arms stretched forward, suggested he had been crawling when death finally claimed him. Even when he could no longer walk, even when his body had consumed every reserve of energy, he had continued moving toward salvation that would never come. 8 of the 9 crew members were eventually recovered. Their bodies were returned to the United States and buried with full military honours. Families finally received closure after 15 years of uncertainty, though the truth of how their loved ones died was almost too terrible to bear, but one crew member was never found. Sergeant Vernon Moore, who had continued the march with Ripslinger after Shelley collapsed, simply vanished into the Sahara. Despite extensive searches, no trace of him was ever discovered. The desert had claimed him completely, and to this day, his final resting place remains unknown. The mystery of why the bomber ended up so far off course was eventually solved through careful analysis of weather data and the aircraft's navigational equipment. The sandstorm had pushed them far off their intended path, and the malfunctioning direction finder had given them false readings about their position. When they bailed out, they believed they were over the Mediterranean, near the coast. In reality, they were hundreds of miles inland, on the edge of one of the most hostile environments on Earth. The military conducted extensive studies on the crew's ordeal, trying to understand how these men had survived so long under such impossible conditions. Desert survival experts examined every aspect of their journey, and the consensus was clear. What these 9 men accomplished defied everything science understood about human endurance. The average person can survive about 3 days without water under normal conditions. In extreme desert heat, that window shrinks to less than 24 hours. Yet these men had walked for more than a week, some for nearly 2 weeks, with virtually no water or food, covering over 100 miles through terrain that even experienced desert nomads avoided. Their story became a case study in military survival training programs. It demonstrated the extraordinary capabilities of the human body when pushed to absolute limits, but it also served as a sobering reminder of how quickly circumstances can spiral beyond control. The bomber itself was eventually recovered, and pieces were brought back for analysis. Some parts ended up in museums, serving as physical reminders of this incredible story. The aircraft had been dubbed Lady Be Good by its crew, and that name became forever associated with one of World War II's most tragic survival ordeals. In the decades since the discovery, the story of Lady Be Good and her crew has been told and retold, each time inspiring awe at the sheer determination these young men displayed. They were just boys really, most barely out of their teens, thrust into an impossible situation by circumstances beyond their control. What makes their story so remarkable isn't just the distances they covered or the conditions they endured. It's that they never stopped trying, even when rescue seemed impossible, even when their bodies were shutting down, even when death was staring them in the face. They kept moving forward. Lieutenant Robert Toner's diary, now preserved in military archives, stands as a testament to their courage. His words document not just their physical ordeal, but their mental and emotional struggle to maintain hope in the face of hopelessness. The final entry, "Everybody getting ready," has been interpreted by historians as the crew making peace with their fate. They had fought as hard as humanly possible, pushed themselves beyond any reasonable limit, and when there was nothing left to give, they faced death with the same courage they had shown throughout their ordeal. Today, the area where Lady Be Good crashed remains one of the most remote and inhospitable regions of the Sahara. Few people ever venture there, and those who do understand, they're walking across ground that claimed 9 American lives in one of history's most extraordinary tests of human endurance. The crew of Lady Be Good walked over 100 miles through conditions that survival experts deemed impossible to endure. They did it with virtually no water, no food, and no real hope of rescue. They did it because they were soldiers, because they had been trained never to surrender, and because the bonds of brotherhood forged in military service demanded they fight until their last breath. When Gordon Bowerman spotted that glint of metal from his plane in 1958, he unlocked a mystery that had haunted 9 families for 15 years. The discovery brought closure, but it also revealed a story so extraordinary that it continues to inspire and horrify in equal measure. The Sahara Desert keeps many secrets, but the story of Lady Be Good and her crew stands as perhaps the most remarkable testament to human determination ever recorded. 9 young men refused to surrender to one of the most hostile environments on Earth, and while the desert ultimately claimed their lives, it could never claim their spirits. Sergeant Vernon Moore's body still lies somewhere out there, in the endless sand, the desert's final secret from that terrible week in April 1943. His name, along with his 8 companions, is forever etched in history as proof that the human spirit can endure far more than we ever imagined possible, even when survival itself is impossible.